as is usually true when I give a talk, I tend to take giant issues, and there's no time to really deal with them the way I would like. So this is going to be very fast-paced. It's a long title. The main focus of the title is actually 20th century and contemporary practices, but I thought I'd just touch on the earlier history to give you a little background before doing that. So let's just get going. This whole area of markets and how art was the patronage and what were the mechanisms and how did things get commissioned and so forth, has not been well studied in Japan. There are a few books, and they tend to deal with different periods and whatnot, but a lot of times the data for the older periods is either not there or has gone unread or unlocated. So when we could go way back into the Nara period and so forth, but to make things very simplified, a lot of the art practices of whatever kind were connected to religion and religious things, and primarily Buddhism, Shinto. Well, there was a fusion between Shinto and Buddhism, and that also promoted Buddhist art. There is, of course, a secular tradition. We have Genji Monogatari and others, but we'll just sort of set that aside for the moment. But looking to the Muromachi period, we get a lot of the painting of the Muromachi and the calligraphy that became prominent was Rinzai Zen calligraphy, and this is a famous sub-temple of Daitokuji that was founded by Ikkyu, one of the most outstanding Rinzai Zen priests of Japan. And this was his home temple. It's been reconstructed, but a lot of the furnishings are still the same, and the overall outlook, the layout of the temple is the same. So this is the main room of the Hojo, the priest quarters. The paintings you can barely see here are by Soga Dasoku, disciple of Ikkyu. Today, this is the same room we are looking at, only we're looking at the far back wall of it. And the temple there displays, these are original calligraphies by Ikkyu. It's not the way they would have traditionally been hung, but you get some sense of the display. But in any case, I'm just showing you these to show that in the 15th century and throughout the Muromachi, a lot of the prominent art forms would actually be done by priests. And sometimes they would sign their work and seal it like Ikkyu did here. The screen paintings are rarely signed and sealed, and the attribution to Soga Dasoku is traditional. Particularly in Rinzai, they emphasize the arts of all kinds. And so a lot of the priests, or a certain number of the priests, became painters and calligraphers, and they were doing commissions, or exactly whether they were commissioned, a lot of the details, the documents that must have once existed are not there, but the older temples are full of art that was actually done by priests that either lived there or by the same sect. Another case, moving a little later, is the Shokokuji Temple in Kyoto. That temple particularly had what must have been priestly ateliers of painters, because so many of the famous painters of the Muromachi period were associated with this temple. All of the original buildings are gone, but we have other major buildings that have been reconstructed. Here's the lecture hall, the Hato, from 1605, so suddenly we're jumping into the Momoyama period. Inside that building, you have this massive chair that's where the head priest would be lecturing from. But I'm showing it to you because of the painting on the ceiling, and this is that painting, and it's attributed to Kano Mitsunobu, a famous Kano painter of the Momoyama period. And this whole idea of doing dragons on the ceiling of major Buddhist halls, particularly Zen things, was a long ongoing tradition, but gives you another sense of how, in this case though, you have Kano Mitsunobu is not a monk. He's a commercial painter, but you have monasteries no longer just depending on their own monks, but employing prominent commercial painters, and that had to have been, some sort of contractual endowment, some sort of payments going on and so forth, but we still are lacking detailed documentation on that. Moving more fully into Momoyama and early Edo period, the amount of painting, and particularly screen painting, both wall painting and folding screen, byobu painting, exploded for many reasons, but the main reason was there was so much warfare going on. Castles and palaces were being built and destroyed in a matter of decades, and new ones. There's incredible turmoil all over Japan, and all of these castles and palaces demanded that there be huge quantities of wall painting. And part of the aesthetic of the Momoyama period that's much celebrated in the work of artists like Kano Eitoku is because of the dynamism of the brushwork and the drama and the large scale and the power, which is all true, but partly this was probably because they had to paint so much so quickly. There was no time to do small, detailed, delicate brushwork. You had to do hundreds of screens very rapidly within a year or two, and led to new manners of painting that could be actually done in that time period. And the profusion of works that were being created, sometimes being created and destroyed, probably half the paintings that were made this time were destroyed within a matter of years because of ongoing warfare. That's the end of the Muromachi, the Momoyama, and the beginning of the Edo. But in early Edo, suddenly you had lots of new domains around Japan with new daimyos, and they all needed art collections. But they didn't have it, and a lot of them were new. They were nouveau riche. They didn't have family traditions. They didn't have things. So they needed to buy and acquire artworks of all kinds rather rapidly, and that led not only tremendous explosion of creation of new works, but also tremendous creation of forgeries of old works. Particularly, lots of people were not in a position to judge what was real and not. The palaces of the rulers, like the Nijo Castle there, this is the center of the main palace complex there at Nijo Castle in Kyoto. If we look inside these buildings, the two larger ones here, particularly the one on the left, we see not only the ceilings and wall paintings being painted largely by Kano artists, but the large pine tree in the back there is a tokonoma where there have been scroll paintings hanging on top of them. So again, the explosion of painting, not only of new paintings, but forgeries of older paintings was going on at a rapid pace. That's the early part of the 17th century, but by the time we moved to the middle 17th century, the merchant class became much more powerful and became some of the primary patrons for artists and painters. And all kinds of new styles came up. It's also interesting, it's not only new styles, but new patterns of usage. I think you're all familiar with byobu, the folding screens. But when they're displayed in museums, or you usually see photographs in situ, they're always in tatami rooms. But actually, there's lots of historical evidence that these screens were taken outside, and you'd have picnics and parties in other areas, and you'd use these to get a slight measure of privacy from other people in the area. And here we see one such case. And these people here, there might be some people of the samurai class, but a lot of the people you see in this are wealthy merchants and those catering to them. But you have gold screens there behind them. And here's one of the most famous screens from that time period, Hikone Byobu. And here too, the background is just gold leaf. So whether they're in a room or outdoors, the left half looks a little like they're in a room, all the way the man is leaning on his sword on the right looks like it might be an outdoor situation. But various things interesting about this. Again, this is this kind of elegant hedonism, listening to music, playing games, and having conversation in a most refined, and yet it's not refined like the nobility, it's not refined like the priesthood. This is the merchant class, basically. And these kinds of screens and the previous ones almost never signed or sealed. So they're actually being painted by so-called machieshi. They're atelier of nowadays anonymous painters of very high quality, turning out large quantities of artwork. If we look closely at this, we not only see the incredible complexity of their hairstyles and the gorgeous fabrics and so forth. But if you look in the back, it's amazing to me, and it's actually gone uncommented on. If we go back here, you see we're looking at the left two panels, actually the second to the left there. There's a folding screen in there. That folding screen is a Muromachi style painting. To me, this is there's often a discourse in art history that, well, you have a period like the Momoyama with all these great artists. You move 50, 60 years later, and suddenly the artists can't do that anymore. And then there's the idea that the skills had decreased and that there's just sort of a deterioration of the aesthetic level. But actually, I think that's not true. What you have is a change of aesthetics. And so that people admired the things of the past, but if you're commissioning a new painting, you wanted in the new style, not in the old style. And so it wasn't the artist couldn't do the old style, but the old style was no longer popular for the current consumption. And this screen is proof of that. Because if we look at that background screen, it's incredibly well done. Representing a style and technique that would have been about 100 years earlier, 150 years earlier. And it's done to an extraordinary degree, and yet it's just an incidental background element in a painting by anonymous painters. This wasn't the elite painters, these were anonymous people working in, and even they could do this. And so it's a demonstration that it wasn't that painters lost their skills, but tastes changed. And as art historians in public, they tend to favor one period or another and use that as a standard to judge everything else, which ends up in absurdities, which unfortunately fill many books. The 17th century saw lots of other major changes in the art world, particularly related to the tea ceremony, which had begun in the late Muromachi, became much more prominent in Momoyama, but it was really in the Edo in the 17th century that the various tea Chanoyu schools became firmly established, which led to all kinds of new patronage for the arts and new forms of art. We look at chashitsu, which are in a garden. The whole idea of a tea garden is all about establishing an environment to view art. It's a very sophisticated, complicated thing. We don't have time we're skipping over the garden elements and all those other kinds of things. And just going to the tea house, you see that the wooden square there, that's the entryway to the tea house, the so-called Nijiriguchi. To look at art in the tea room in this so-on style, you had to literally crawl into the room. Yeah. So that's, if you think about it today, someone says, I'd like you to come over and look at this important painting I have. Oh, by the way, you have to get on your hands and knees and crawl into the room. You know, it's a radical concept, but influenced a great many things. So if you crawl through that door, there on the lower right corner there, you see a bit of the wooden, that's the inside of that same door. So if you go in, then you're in this very small room with all kinds of unusual features that we won't have time to talk about now, but all of those features are there not only to be admired in their own right, but to set up an appropriate context for looking at what's in the tokonoma, which is, like in this case, a calligraphy. So we're in the same room, but we're rotating around and looking at the tokonoma with a hanging scroll. So in a certain sense, the garden, all of this is layers of environment that are being set up so that you can properly appreciate that. And here's another one. This is another very famous interior of a tea room. We don't have time to discuss the aesthetics, except that it's an incredible concept where you're developing a garden, a special building, and all kinds of features just to look at one object. It's actually rare. However, in the tea ceremony, there's often a meal, kaiseki meal, that went with it that employed all these different types of things. They wouldn't come out all at once here. It would be served one at a time, but they're grouping them all together, and you see the diversity of lacquer and different types of ceramics and porcelain and earthenware, and all these kinds of things were introduced into the experience of viewing what was in the tokonoma. There are many different types. We were looking at the most extreme type of Soan tokonoma, but here is another style where it's you walk into this room through sliding panels. There's no crawling in, and there are many different styles of these tea rooms. But all of this, these tea rooms, who has enough money to build a garden and a special building and the land and all of this to do this? Only the most wealthy, most powerful people in Japan had the financial and social standing to be able to do that. But they also started making huge collections of artwork. And in doing the collections of artwork, what's real, what's fakes, because fakes were there from the beginning. And all of this became very complicated. So you have families that went on for centuries whose sole business was to authenticate artworks. The most famous family devoted this was the so-called kohitsu, which just means like old brushwork, but that became their family name. And they put documents into the boxes for these works, and this is an example of a letter talking about that. But they also standardized these vertical strips here, they're about this big, give the name of the work and claiming its authenticity. On the back they have dates, and then they're set on top of a chart of all of these different people in the kohitsu family. So in terms of merchandising art, having official authentication that this is actually genuine became a big part of the merchandising aspect. By the 18th century, things were continuing to expand, and the middle class that I was talking about actually becomes vastly larger than in the 17th century. And they start having large homes. They need screens and byobu and other things. And there are various levels of wealth. There's sort of a middle class, too, that's kind of come along with this. And so buying or commissioning a screen, like a pair of 6-panel screens, was a lot of money. And a lot of times people either wouldn't have that money or they wouldn't have that money at one time. And so they would make a byobu club where you might have 12 members, and everybody would contribute 1/12 the price of a screen, and then draw a lottery, like who gets the first screen, who gets the second, and everybody's putting a time payment sort of things. And this was happening not only with minor artists, but with very famous ones like Ike Taiga and so forth, that there were these ways of making it easier for people to afford these things. Here's one of Taiga's most famous and would have been most expensive because it's on gold. He usually didn't paint on gold. But these kinds of screens became a larger market for them because of these merchandising techniques that were developed. And then in the Meiji period, actually the late Edo and the Meiji period, we suddenly have all kinds of new exhibition venues, which had been very rare in the past, but became increasingly commonplace. Art organizations, private organizations, groupings of artists, and art schools. The first official art schools developed, and all this too exploded the merchandising of painting into a whole new level of complexity and diversity and quantity. You had the official content, which is a general term for all of the different government-sponsored art exhibitions. Here we have, they had to make new buildings, and they made these paintings of huge size, which wouldn't fit in most homes or places. That often became an issue, but they were really created for exhibition. And part of the motive when you have these national shows is to make, if you make a painting, and here's a very famous painting in the left edge here, we're highlighting it. That's Takeuchi Seiho's posing for the first time, one of his famous paintings, and there on the right we see it, how it was originally displayed. So painting like this becomes very famous, but it's too big in terms of Japanese architecture for most people to even think about getting it. But from a merchandising effect, to have a famous work at a national show doesn't mean that everybody's going to try and buy it, but that may mean when that work becomes very famous that they want something by that artist. And so having received prizes and lots of press attention for very large-scale works was tremendously successful in the sales of smaller works that were more adaptable to actual architecture and the pocketbooks of the patrons. There's a big international push there, particularly it's not studied as much or even known as much now as it once was, but in the beginning eras of the Taisho, there was a big interchange between some Indian philosophers and poets and artists and Japan, particularly the art organization Inten became heavily connected to India. Famous people like Rabindranath Tagore came to Japan and encouraged his students to come to Japan, not just to teach Japanese about Indian things, but for them to learn about Nihonga painting techniques and new ideas. And lots of Japanese painters went to India for sometimes 2 and 3 years or repeatedly. And there's a huge interchange between India and Japan that affected all kinds of different levels of aesthetics and materials and approaches. But also in the 20th century, now we're really getting into the area that's the subject of the talk. All this has just been a rapid prologue. So in the 20th century, everything started changing radically in terms of art markets. And one of the key things was the more and more prominent dealers throughout Japan, most of the cities of Japan, there were art dealers, and the biggest cities grouped them together in art clubs, especially Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and Nagoya. And they would have monthly or regular, sometimes many times a month, sales of artwork, and they were, you couldn't just go there because you were a dealer, you had to be admitted. There was lots of complexity about getting admission. They were definitely not open to the public. The public couldn't see anything about them, although records of how much things were sold for often got out to the public later on. They resulted in these massive catalogs. This is one of the most massive. It was connected to the Fujita family. This catalog is about that thick and even has triple fold-out pages and all kinds of deluxe features. These catalogs were actually paid for by the people who are selling their work. So it was a kind of self-promotion, but they were issued for every sale for all of these different art organizations from late Meiji, and they're still being done now. So as a record of the sales and transactions of what they were sold for, and they have photographs and sometimes other information, is invaluable record. But it also gives you some sense of the incredible amounts of money that were going on at that time. Today in Kyoto on Shimonsen, this sort of diagonal, sort of nondescript, sort of white long building in the center, that's the Kyoto Art Club today. You can't walk into it, it's only for the members, but even now there are very major art auctions going on there throughout the year for members of the club only. Just who was buying all this and who was selling it? The Zaibatsu industry, all the major families of Japan had huge collections, and they were selling them when they needed money or for various reasons. But in the 1920s and 30s, the sales of art rose to incredible levels, both in the quantity and the quality and the prices that were actualized. But also a very key feature in all of this is rather unique globally, although department stores are everywhere. Department stores very early on became deeply involved in the merchandising of art. And they, even today, they do that. One way of doing it was to patronize the artists, and they would hold sort of retrospective shows for contemporary artists in the department store itself. And that would draw in huge crowds of people, but also some of those paintings would end up for sale by the department store. When in the post-war world, this post-World War II world, this continued, and certainly even today, every year there are many major art exhibitions being held by department stores. However, their art business is diminished greatly. They still sell things, but what they sell tends to be kind of mediocre level. But back in the Taisho in the 1920s and so on, a lot of the finest works by the finest artists were actually being sold by department stores. And there was a huge connection between artists and department stores in the financing, display, and distribution of artwork. So today, if you know department stores in Japan, Takashimaya, Daimaru, Mitsukoshi, and many others were leading the forefront of this kind of involvement. This is a 1931 poster from Mitsukoshi in Shinjuku for Takahisa Imeji show. These were hugely popular, drawing giant audiences. And at the same time, in the cities, art sale areas developed so that in certain sections of the city became known for concentration of art galleries and antique galleries. And this is true in all the cities, but due to the mass firebombing in World War II, and even the fear of the firebombing, there were huge sections of cities that were torn down to create fire breaks. Since they knew there was going to be firebombing, but they gravely underestimated the scale of it, so most of these fire breaks didn't have any meaning because bombs were dropping on both sides of the break, so they effectively were meaningless. But these things tore up the art areas of all the cities, and in the post-war world, they largely scattered throughout the city. But Kyoto alone had several areas that, because they didn't have firebombing, survived. And you can still get some sense of it. this is one such area, Shimonzen and Furumonzen in the Gion area of Kyoto, still lined with antique stores, although that area is changing almost month by month, and we will get to that in a minute. Actually, if you look at this, you see art stores. Do you see any people on the street? I first came to Japan in 1971, and at that time, through much of the year, this street was choked with people. Japanese, foreigners, going into the shops, buying things. And there were sales, the dealer auctions are the main way that dealers get things. We'll get to them in a minute. But the biggest frenzy of dealer auctions, although they go on through the year, is in the spring and the fall. And spring and fall is usually the greatest art season traditionally in Japan. And it used to be that, like, to go to these stores, if you wanted to talk to someone, because they tend to be small, if someone's already in there, you wait until they leave, and then you go in. And so there's a lot of people waiting. There are kisatens around there where you, if the shop was busy, you'd go to a kiseten and try again in a half an hour, this sort of thing. But for reasons that will become apparent soon, this kind of walk-in street traffic has almost vanished in Japan. So what happens? How does shops remain open? They've moved to using catalog sales, publishing 2 or 3, sometimes even 5 or 6 times a year, catalogs of works that are set priced, and you can first come, first serve when the catalog comes out. But they also do shop auctions. The catalog is very much like a regular sales catalog, but the prices there are not fixed prices. Those are minimum bid prices, and then there's like a week or 2 week to put in over the transom bids. So they're not live action auctions. You don't know what other people are bidding. You just put in a blind bid, and maybe you get it, maybe you don't. These kinds of catalog and shop auctions have increased greatly. They actually started as a way just to augment the on-the-street sale or old customer sale technique. But when those dropped off, the many shops that used to see these catalog sales as a side venture are now their main way of selling, because there's the on the street has almost disappeared. So this is an example of interior of one of the larger shops, and this is during a sale. This isn't an auction. Everything's a fixed price, but they put out a catalog, and for several weeks there'll be a sale like this. And in the bigger ones, there may be 3 or 4 floors with art objects put out that will be rotated, and largely they're painting in calligraphy. They're mounted as scrolls. There's frames, and then there's also a certain amount of lacquer and ceramics being sold. And so you get a sense, these little white tags there are the price tags. The most expensive ones, they say, ask us, they don't publish the prices on the highest ones, but most of them have a clear-cut set price. But this, where are the dealers getting all of this? The vast majority of the artwork in the art dealers are from dealer auctions. And these aren't just the art clubs that I talked about. There are dozens and dozens of private auction organizations that are not as large, but still very large. Take this room, for example. This room is about the size of an art auction room at the Kyoto Art Club. Non-members are not allowed, but through special circumstances, I saw the whole day auction twice there for a particular shop that had a private thing. So you have a room this big. Where I'm sitting, there'd be people that are bringing in objects. There'd be a scribe to be writing down sale prices and who's buying it. And then there's an incline. The incline, they're not raised like this, it'd be totally flat, but there'd be a board about the size of this table at an incline about like this. And up here, they would do something that would horrify any museum person. They'd take a scroll and just flip it like this. So it rolls down the incline. As soon as it's down, the bidding starts. And there's no time to look. You have to immediately look at it, judge the condition, judge whether you want it, judge how much you could pay for it. It's very, it's not for the faint of heart, in fact. Lots of people try to become it, they can't do it because it's just too nerve-wracking. But where are the people? Here's the rack here. The most important dealers are in a U right around this rack, so they can just lean over and look at it. But behind them, there's stepped seating, like in an auditorium. So there's 3-4 letters. So in a room of this size, there may be 150 dealers looking at this rack. Some of them looking at it from 3 or 4 meters away or more. You're allowed to be very dramatic. Sometimes someone up here just literally jumps out of everything, rushes over and sort of falls over the painting, looks at it for a second. That's not approved behavior, but it happens every auction. There's some instances like that. So from the time the scroll rolls down to the time the bidding ends is usually less than a minute. Less than a minute. And then it goes on, and it starts in the morning. The biggest ones go on to they start about 9 or 10 in the morning. The biggest ones go on to 1 or 2 in the morning. And as many as 1,200 or 1,500 paintings be sold in one day under these circumstances. There are astami before a previous day. Some of the most important works will be displayed for the members. But most of them are seen for the first time in this circumstance that I just mentioned. When I went to the auction for the first time and explained something that I'd always wondered about, because I was haunting the shops not as a customer, but as an art historian, because so much of the artwork is not in museums or it's not visible in private collections, but only by going to the shops can you photograph and record things in large quantity. And again and again, I was at a shop looking at something, and then several people in the shop would rush in with furoshiki with maybe 30, 40 scrolls, and they'd rush to the back of the shop and open it up and hurriedly start looking at everything. I thought, what's going on? They've just bought this. Why? It seemed inexplicable. But when I saw this method, it became entirely obvious is that they're finding what they bought. In other words, they had to make all of these decisions in a split-second manner. And then only when they bring them back and hang them up can they really check the condition or get some idea of what the real quality, whether it's real or fake and so forth. So to do all of this and do it well requires extraordinary skill, but no matter how much knowledge and skill you have, you're bound to make mistakes. You, in fact, have to make mistakes. There's no other way around it. But this is how this whole economy works. In other words, so you've taken the paintings back to the shop and you say, a third are forgeries. What do you do with those? That's a very complicated question. But one of the simplest things is to put it into another auction, maybe at a different city or something like that, and try to filter it out this way. Actually, the quantity of forgeries is so large that if you had a litmus test that would immediately remove all forgeries and stuff from the market would certainly collapse to a certain degree, because it really runs, you don't really have the quality and quantity to supply this whole market with original works. So it's a very interesting and complicated system that's quite different in most respects than the Western manner. Almost all these auctions in Japan for art are private and they're members only. To be a member is very complicated, and most of them you can't just put in an application and say, oh, I have a good store and I have some money. That doesn't get you anywhere. What do you have to do for the major ones? You have to have members, sometimes 2 or 3 members to recommend you. But what's the bottom line of recommending someone? If that person fails financially, you're responsible for their bills. That's really a commitment, you know. So if somebody collapses and they go into like a $500,000 debt, the people that pay for it isn't the person that collapsed because they don't have any money. It's the person that recommended them into the organization. And so it's, you know, not something that you do lightly. So there are a lot of interesting aspects to this whole system, and that's one of them. Public auctions do exist, but they're very, very few. There's only a couple in Tokyo and in the Kansai. But this gives you an idea of what an actual public auction is. In a public auction, there's usually 2 or 3 days of viewing. And here we see everything from suits of armor to scrolls and teaware and so forth. One of these auctions may have again, 1,000 items or so, and there's 2 days to look at them. And the nice thing about looking at them is that photography is allowed. You can handle them. You can look at the boxes or do anything that's not, you know, that won't damage the works and consider them. These have their own levels of I mean, there's everything from great works. Great works are rare at a public auction like this. They're very rare. They do turn up. Sometimes they're misidentified or whatever. There's a middle range that's good. There's mass quantities of forgeries. I think a lot of dealers dump the stuff they can't sell at the dealer auction into the public auctions. And so a lot of the quality is iffy, but there are major things. Dealers go there, and sometimes they make major dealers occasionally go there, and sometimes they make discoveries. But mostly they don't go there because things of similar quality are available in the dealer auctions at a lower price than the public auctions, although the public auctions prices are generally lower than what you find in the usual shop. And here you see teawares of various kinds, and all of this is, again, viewing before a public sale. Once in a while, they'll set up a special area, like they're sort of mimicking the interior of a tea room here and putting out higher quality chanoyu-dogu. And the contemporary works or near contemporary works come up, like this Ayo, a painter and printmaker who was famous for using rainbow color motifs and different types of tea utensils from kogo and chaire and futaoki and so forth. Raku bowls, here you see black raku bowls, and you see the boxes behind there with, sometimes they're inscribed by the maker, but for older bowls, they're usually later generations of the Raku family writing their guarantee that this is who it claims to be there. Byobu are at a huge disadvantage these days because few people have the size. Even wealthy people are downsizing their houses all the time, and to have even a 6-panel screen, much less a 12-panel screen, there's no room for it. There's no room to store it, and so screen prices are plummeting. And also, most screens have some kind of damage on them. You know, somebody bumped it, or it's stained, or the hinges are weak. To have Byobu repair is very expensive, and so the repair often is as much or more than the cost of the objects. It's another disincentive for screens today. This is by a very famous 19th century calligrapher, but would have gone for a comparatively low price despite its authenticity and quality because of this. Before we go on to contemporary art, just a word about this, moving back to the tea things, because one of the biggest changes in the 20th century, particularly post-war world, is what's happened to the tea schools. And when I came to Japan in 1971, the tea schools were at their peak. And there's kind of a pyramidal organization with the Iamoto at top and then higher levels, and then moving down to an enormous base that in the major tea schools would have been millions of people. In some cases, it could have even been close to 10 million people down at the lower level. Tea schools were educational system where at the lower level you have the beginners. After a few years, you could take a test to rise to the next level. But to take the test, you had to pay money just to be able to take the test. And if you failed, then you could take it again. But each time you did it, you'd have to pay the same amount of money. And the higher you went in the system, the higher the price was for the getting to the next stage. So that after a certain point, midway, if you pass that test, then you could set yourself up as a teacher officially of that school and make money by having students. But taking that test was a huge amount of money. But the irony was in this buying your test is you're not buying the results, but you're buying the chance to take the test, that there were very skilled tea people that were just below the teacher level, and we're never going to be at the teacher level because they're never going to have enough money to take that test. So that there were actually people that were above them in the system that weren't as good as some other people that were sort of trapped in the lower levels because of this fee system. And from the lowest part to the top, this money trickled upwards. So that the heads of the tea school were enormously wealthy. And not only enormously wealthy, but enormously socially influential. For many decades, Hatsugama, which is the first tea ceremony of the year for the major tea schools, particularly Urasenke, was on the one day after New Year's, there'd be on television all of the reporting of who attended the Urasenke Hatsugama. And there would be the prime minister, a number of the key members of the parliament, some of the most wealthiest people of Japan, owners of major corporations and stuff, were all there. And they're there to be seen at this occasion and have the publicity that they're there. And this was just a yearly ritual. Hatsugama go on today, but they're not on the news. They're hardly recorded. And this is because the social situation and the financial situation has radically altered. Who were those people at the bottom in this old pyramid? They were largely unmarried women. And the tea schools became for unmarried women, a kind of Western concept of the old finishing school. Acquiring levels of keigo, polite speech, being able to do tea for special occasions, but also just how to appropriately handle things, talk to people, move, what kinds of kimono to wear, all of these kinds of things were involved with this. So those women, and this was also, even in the early 70s, most people were still being married to the omiai system of, sort of assigned marriage. And to be a candidate then, having several years of tea school training made you an appropriate young woman to marry in your class or above your class in terms of, so the big incentive was all of that. But as Japanese structure and marriage arrangements and everything changed, this pyramid got narrower and narrower and narrow until it's more like a pillar than a pyramid. And people are still doing it, but this huge base, has vanished. And which means that the tea schools, the money involved, they're still wealthy people, but they're partly wealthy because they've been wealthy for a long time rather than current income. And their social position in Japanese society is radically changed. But this doesn't just affect tea, it affects everything, actually. Because for this tea, you have kimono, you have lacquer, you have bamboo utensils, you have ceramic utensils, you have incense, you have all of these different traditional crafts. The primary patrons were from people involved in tea. So when that collapses, it means that all these traditional industries and crafts and stuff are collapsing as a result. And this is changing the art markets radically. Right now we're having a lot of the old Chajin, the people that were devoted a good part of their life to tea, and they may be business people or whatever, but they were deeply involved with tea. They're dying. Their children and grandchildren totally uninterested. You know, there's all these boxes in the house full of implements. Like, what are we going to do with this stuff? You know, grandfather liked them, but it doesn't mean anything to us. Besides, we're moving into a smaller house now. So these things are just being dumped into these auctions. And so it means that now high quality tea things with good denrai, or, you know, which is a tradition of who owned it and the documents associated, all of this is nosediving. And the major museums, the major tea organizations already have large collections, so they make occasional purchases, but they're not really in the market for buying lots of these things. And so this has really caused chaos, and not just in the art markets, but Kyoto economy was always based on fabric manufacture. But the fabric in 1971, you could go to the Nishijin area, and it was noisy almost 24 hours a day because the looms going on everywhere, not just big places like this room. Even small houses would have a loom in it, and there's this clackety-clack of the looms going on all the time. You can't hear that anywhere for decades. And the whole economy has collapsed, and the only thing that's doing any action really is tourism. And so there are hotels going up in every corner to an absurd degree. I think they're way overbuilding, but that's the only thing that seems to have any prospect of generating money. But all of these traditional crafts things that used to have stores and outlets all over city that were being patronized by Japanese of all levels are getting smaller and smaller and increasingly vanishing. And so this whole centrality of the tea system, which was easy to be critical of, you know, this omiai system and young women who are taking all this, that was bad, and yet a side effect of it was supporting all of these other kinds of things. And with that money gone, then everything is changing radically. So let's go to, so what, if this is, in terms of the art market, there are two signal features that are going on right now. One is that in the old days, and we're talking very relative, I'm thinking 30, 40 years ago, if you're looking at art stores and antique stores, there used to be specialties. This store specialized in this school of art, or these 3, 4 artists were the main ones they focused on, and there was all this diversity of what, so you might have 100 stores, but they weren't all after the same things. Some were after this, some were after this. But with this collapse of all of these kind of traditional value system in terms of art, a lot of those old specialties are no longer viable. So you can't just specialize in those artists. There's not enough customers to support you. So increasingly, the market is extremely distorted right now with the larger number of the older art forms and older artworks. The prices are crashing. So what happens is that everybody forgets the idea of being a specialist. Everybody's just like, what's going to sell? You know, that's, you know, we've got to focus on what's going to sell now. And so if an artist becomes hot on the market, everybody wants that. And when I say everybody, I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about the shops. They all want it. In the old auction, say a particular artist would come up in a nice work by that, but 3/4 of the shops never dealt with that artist. So even though they had money, they could buy it, they wouldn't buy it because, that's not what we do. But now that diversity of the market has vanished, and everybody, big or small, are after an increasingly small number of hot items and hot artists. And so while the market as a whole is sagging, those prices are skyrocketing. Because everybody wants them, because they think if I get that, I can sell it. There was also another marketing strategy in the past. If you're a wealthy shop that have resources, if an artist or a type of object becomes temporarily unpopular, the prices drop, you buy them, not with the idea of selling them soon. That would be impossible. But there was almost a sine wave of changes in popularity. So you could, if you're a wealthy shop, you would be selling the things that are hot now, but you're buying the things that are not hot now with the idea of holding on to them for 10 or 20 years. Their prices will rise, and you'll have a repository of fine things bought at a low price. And so this was a pattern of the bigger staff. Nobody's doing that anymore. Why are they not doing that? Nobody has any faith in the future. Nobody has any idea of what's going to happen, because in traditional, and now these terms are vague, but when saying, if we look over the last 80 years, there was a tendency for people that were younger, in their 20s and 30s, even maybe in their 40s, not being interested in collecting or having artwork around so much. But if they became economically secure, had the size of a house and so forth, the idea of at least buying some original artwork was a custom. And so that you would look at people in the 40s, 50s, and older as your big target base. And so the fact that people in their 20s and 30s aren't interested didn't bother anyone, because those same people would eventually change their attitudes as their income and their social status changed. But that's not happening now. Younger people, or people who are younger and they're going in their 40s and 50s, they're totally broken off from that. And the whole impact of digital art forms and other kinds of things, the non-traditionality, tradition is sometimes used as a motif or an inspiration for contemporary art, but it's not continuing in an integral sense of tradition, but being inspired in a more abstract way. So the actual sources of it are not being interested in, but maybe a reformation of it. In any case, nobody knows what the future is, so the contemporary art is the hot scene. But that too is very complicated, because there's aspiring artists all over Japan. But to give you an example of how complicated it is and how tough it is to be in the contemporary art world as a young artist, even of considerable quality, there's an art store. Actually, I'm blanking on the name, but let's just say this is a premium art store for contemporary art that has been in business for 100 years or so, and it has handled many of the top artists, both in Nihonga and oil painting, for all of this time. And then every year there's a Tokyo International Art Fair held in central Tokyo, and they always have a primary spot there. And this gallery, though, I went there, I don't know, this must have been 10 years ago, and they had the work of a young woman who was doing small works, and a lot of the things shown there are small because the most patrons, even with collections, don't have large wall surfaces. In any case, she had a lot of paintings. They were oil paintings, and setting aside the style, they were very complex. So if you just think of the time involved in creating one of these works, would be really large, because they were technically very complicated, very interesting, all very different from one another, and very, very labor intensive. but what shocked me was here is one of the galleries at the top of the pyramid, and they have a special show at the biggest, sale of the year, and the prices were about, it might have been about $2,000 of work. The gallery clearly would take at least 50% of that. So when you look at how labor intensive these works were, here's somebody, I mean, they're not famous, they're aspiring, they're being promoted by a top-ranked gallery at the #1 show, but, they were selling some, but even if they sold all of them, it wouldn't even support them from a year. But this is somebody who's at the top gallery, at the top sale of the year, and the prices are that low. So if you go to the art schools and you see people and stuff, most of them are, even the most talented that are doing some very interesting work, are living in terrible conditions, barely have enough money to buy their materials. Even they have some independent shows, they don't sell much. It's a real struggle. I mean, creating art is always a struggle, but it's very severe. On the other hand, you have selected artists, maybe 50 to 100, that are doing well not only nationally but internationally. And the most expensive artists are mostly succeeding because of their international audience now. And that's what I want to talk about. Well, here. So it's the international audience, and how do you appeal to that? It's leading to whole new ways of marketing art. And this is, I'm showing you in the next couple slides one of these. Basically, it's an art warehouse. It's really, they're even called a warehouse. Here's the building. It's a very long building. We're just seeing the end of it. It's not in central Tokyo, but it has large-scale works that are put in these large spaces, and they're anybody can go there, but it's in a very inconvenient place to go. This place actually replaced another one that of the same type that it was near the Contemporary Art Museum in Tokyo. If you know that, it was about 20-minute walk from in an industrial area with just industrial warehouses. There was this, got the address of like, this is the main gallery thing for large-scale works for a lot of the top galleries in Tokyo. And the entryway was, it looked like a worker's entry in the back of an industrial warehouse. I mean, there was no sign, there wasn't even a sign of what it was. There's a little staircase, a tiny door, you go in and suddenly there's big galleries inside. But these big galleries were largely empty. They had one or two people that were could ask questions, but they had large scale paintings that were of the size for Western museums or Western homes and so forth, and went through many floors, included some of the top artists in terms of sale prices in Tokyo. And on the way out, there was a shipping area that had an area that was about the size of this room, because this is a huge building with many floors. And it was full of wooden crates of large-scale works, and I looked on the labels, and they were being sent to art exhibitions and top museums all over Europe and America. They were all, not a single destination wasn't super famous, and so you had, just for immediate shipment, there must have been 40 or 50 large-scale wooden crates sending out all over the world. Those same stores will have other galleries in Tokyo that have smaller works. And that's where the usual customer is going for home, because they can't fit these big works, but the big prices are on the big works. And this is part of a commodification that you see globally. And the whole psychology of art has changed in many ways. Just to give you a little example, it used to be thought that prices were high because of rarity, you know. In other words, this is unique. There's only one Mona Lisa or something like this. This kind of unique. But when you think about contemporary marketing values, you make much more money by having a series rather than a unique piece. And this is being done in the West, but now it's being done in Japan. So in other words, if you make a 20-foot, I'll leave out the names, but if you fill in your own names, a 20-foot sculpture and you make one, well, you may, if you're famous, you may make a lot of money. But what if you make an edition of 10? And then you have X famous museum in Switzerland or another museum in New York buy two of them. It becomes, it floats the price of all of them, you know, like, oh, I have one just like the one in Zurich, or I have the one like was shown in Venice last year. And everybody knows there's multiple, but a limited number, you know. So you not only get more because you're selling more, but actually the individual prices rise. So in other words, you had one, it would be at this price. If you make 10, the individual price would actually be higher. And these kinds of marketing strategies are wildly successful, not only with a number of the top Japanese, but, you know, Richter and other people turning out, you know, it's a mass production, it's a real commodification of art that has almost nothing to do with the aesthetics, but a lot to do with many other factors, even including money laundering or other kinds of things. And so this is the area that's really hot in Japan now. And the older stores that are finding that their older artworks aren't selling well are all kind of putting their toes into this market, seeing if they can make it, because ultimately, although a lot of them are very personally committed to older art forms or other art forms, or even to aspiring younger artists, there's not a lot of money in it. So how do you maintain your business? So this is the part of the rapidly changing art world there. The bulk of the shops are very worried about the future. Some of them are collapsing, some of them are changing their strategies. Everybody's desperate to find, to have a viability for their business, where the older things that I was discussing as the early 20th century were part of the, it changed all the time, but it was an ongoing, there was a stability. If you had a shop, you did well, you thought, well, I'll pass this shop on to my future generations of the family, and you did that with confidence. All of that's sort of evaporated now. And so what's coming next is hard to say, but there's these huge changes. It does mean that there are opportunities for museums and so forth to collect and get good things, but there's, having known lots of museums and lots of things in various countries, the nature of directorships and other things, and the people, a board of directors that are above the directors has changed tremendously. And the one thing that's continually amazed me when you're thinking of art market dynamics is that a lot of the idea, like in the stock market, the old adage is still true: buy low, sell high. But what happens in the art market? Buy high, sell low, which museums do all the time. They want the most expensive object because then they can brag about it, you know, and say, oh, there was auction, everybody wanted it, but we got it, and now it's in our museum. 20 years later, it may no longer be popular. 50 years later, it's, why do we have this around, you know? It's time to deaccession. And this happens all the time. It's, when you think about the collecting of art, like thinking about the like the American collections of old master paintings in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the big collections that were formed in the U.S. that are now the mainstay of the major U.S. museums were bought by wealthy people, but actually the prices they were paying were very cheap. Old master paintings at that time were very inexpensive, and they were buying up at a time when there was lots of quantity. The best ones were getting good art historical advice and making clever purchases and stuff. But that idea of doing that, when prices are low, you have quantity, you can get the best at a low price and have choice and all of this. At the upper levels, it's just a scramble to get anything. So there's all kinds of odd distortions and sort of counterintuitive practice is standard in a lot of this, which is due to certain social structures about how art is perceived. One other thing that affected all of this, that shows how radically different the position of art in Japan is now than it was in the pre-war world, was that these big government shows, the Bunten and Teiten, the artists had to ship their works, which are huge, and they'd go to the museums, and there'd be hundreds of works. There'd be famous artists that have been designated judges, and they'd be viewing them all. They'd be brought out, like 5 people bringing this one out, 5 bringing this, go on for days. All this was being reported in the press. Newspapers were full of photographs of the judges looking at the works, and then the people that got the awards later on, these were headlines just for ordinary people, It's inconceivable today, that social prominence for art exhibitions and artists and so forth. So it's an enormous transformation. In any case, this is some sense of what's going on there. This is also related to book publication and catalogs and exhibitions. When I first went to Japan in '71, I was dumbfounded. Like in central downtown Kawamachi area, from between Shijo and Sanjo, there were 6 or 7 major bookstores whose main focus was selling art books, and it's just unbelievable quantities of art books, new publications, new series of this and that coming out, and the old ones being maintained in stock because they were still selling well. And it was just, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. But now it started changing by the late 80s and early 90s. The popularity of these books and the selling of them was dropping, and most of back in the 90s, the art sections in many bookstores were either eliminated or reduced and replaced with computer guidebooks, quite literally. I took photographs of these changes back then because it was so dramatic. So the art book publication is just a trickle now compared to the way it once was, and it was partly, it's a chicken and the egg kind of thing, the books are there and spread the knowledge, which leads to more purchasing or more appreciation, but also which comes first. I mean, the artwork promotes the books promote the artworks, but all of that is radically changing. Of course, you have all kinds of online sources, but online sources are good just for Joho, but their connection to sales is much more ambiguous. Bookstores themselves, these were 2 of the big bookstores of Kyoto. Left was Marzen. Marzen is one of the oldest bookstores in Japan, and that on the left was their new building from like late 1980s or so, and then they sold it and it became Game Central. It's still the same building, but that whole building was totally a bookstore, but now it's miscellaneous video games. And there on the right was that used to be Kinokuniya, another very famous bookstore, and we got Game Panic. So the future is open. Usually that has a very nice sound to it, and certainly it does have full of potential, but it's also full of ambiguity in a way that's hard to categorize. These things I've said today about contemporary are my personal opinions, but I want to tell you that I've been talking with dealers for decades about this, and everyone I talk to agrees totally with what I'm saying today. And they don't publicize it, they don't give interviews about it, but among themselves, these are the conversations they're having. And so it's a very dramatic and uncertain time. But again, Japan is still full of young artists of talent, but how those people can actually have careers, and we're not even talking about becoming famous, but just having an ongoing career as an artist the way you used to, is increasingly difficult terrain. One other thing about the international market, even in traditional things, there's an important American collector of contemporary ceramics. He collects many things, but he likes going around to the kilns and actually all over Japan and buying directly from the potters at the kilns. And he brought me together with three of, they were in their 40s and 50s, contemporary potters who were reasonably successful. They've had many independent shows, they've had prizes and so forth. And over lunch, he finally came up with a very interesting question, which was, if you lost all of your foreign clientele, what would happen to your production? And so these three people, two of them said they'd have to shut down. They couldn't even continue because foreign purchasing was 50 to 70% of their overall income. So if the foreign market disappeared, they would just have to do something else. And the other person said that the foreign clientele was about 40 to 50%. It would radically restructure their business, but they figured they could still make a go of it on a reduced scale. And this is part of the international spectrum. And one last word in that is that I see students and newspaper reporters and other people saying, "Oh, contemporary art is global, nationalities are meaningless. You don't need to learn about Japan or Mexico or anywhere because it's all part of this wonderful new, neutral, open, the best people survive." It's a ridiculous concept, but it's commonly held. Why is it ridiculous? Because it certainly is global. You have Art Basel all over the world and all this sort of thing. But who succeeds and why is still very much a Eurocentric pattern. And so what they approve of, and I don't know what you hear about Murakami Takashi here, but he's a classic example of this. His whole idea of super flat is 100% bogus. And yet the reason it became so popular is very interesting, though, aside from skillful self-promotion. The thing that was interesting is that Japanese art has never been flat, even in prints. But even young Japanese don't know that. Young Japanese are so indoctrinated in Western ideas of spatial representation that for them too it looks flat. So for him to say, "Oh, I'm going to be super Japanese because Japanese illustration and painting has always been flat, but now I'm going to be super flat, like super Japanese, But and of course, this is wildly popular in the West because, of course, Japanese art has always been flat. And now the premier Japanese artist is saying that it's always flat. And so all of our stereotypes in the past were not stereotypes, but keen insights, and so it's enormously flattering to Western tastes and stuff. And actually, he wasn't successful in Japan early part of the career. I saw some of his early exhibitions in Shibuya. And he wasn't a name brand there, but I thought, well, here's a new, I'll go, well, this is kind of okay, but nothing, It was only after he was picked up by Western galleries and other things, and then he got on this, well, let's make a philosophy out of this and doing all this, so this kind of, it's just one artist in one situation, but these kind of dynamics show that under the rubric of it all being a neutral global space, and we don't need, it's a mirage. It is global, but it is commodifying, but it's anything but neutral or unbiased or that sort of thing. And so, food for thought. In any case, thank you for listening to this, and hope you get stimulated by some of it. Thank you very much. I leave you with a recent exhibition of Kawanabe Kyosai's enormous, we see photos, but it's actually enormous painting of heaven and hell, and the viewers at the Tokyo National Museum contemplating not only the past, but the future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berry, and we will open a session of questions and answers.
I'm happy to entertain any question. Can you?
Thank you very much. Is it possible for a foreigner to be part of this art association, like this Dantais? And if so, what will be the requirement?
You're talking about the dealer clubs?
Yes,
yeah.
The dealer club.
It's theoretically possible, but almost never happens. Actually, there was a man, Richard Lane, who was lived in Japan. He had a doctorate in art history, but lived in Japan as a scholar, but actually as a dealer for half a century. And he got included in some of the major things. I have an interesting anecdote, though, about how that worked, because in one of the two auctions these big auctions that had almost 300 dealers there, he was there in a primary position along with the top dealers of Japan, but he's not one of the top dealers of Japan, but he was sitting right next to where the scrolls were coming out, but he wasn't buying much. But why was this man at that position was a huge question for me. And in the day of auction, he only bought one thing, and it was very interesting because a big cardboard box of shumpon, of woodblock printed erotic books from the Edo period came up. It wasn't sorted, it was just a big thing. And the auctioneer said this, and everybody in the room turned to look at him. He bid like Juman, like 100,000 yen for a whole box of shumpon, unsorted. And then he continued to sit there, but he continued for the rest of the auction. He was sorting them. But nobody even else bid on him. And he was there, and everybody's like, oh, okay, he's going to buy them. He bought them, so we can go on. And so he had a very unusual function. And then I talked to one of the biggest dealers in Japan and asked him, this was decades later, what it was about Lane that he got this access. And it wasn't just he was buying erotica that everybody else wouldn't buy, but he was buying weird stuff that no one else would buy, and actually filled a big house full of stuff that was largely forgeries and weird things. And they liked him for this, because if he wasn't buying, all of that would go unsold. And so he eventually rose to a position of prominence, not because of buying great things. Occasionally he did buy great things, but mostly he was vacuuming up all of this stuff that was largely unsellable. And that was making everything run well, and so he was a very popular person. So there's no strictures that say that you have to be Japanese, and I'm sure there's some Chinese, there might be a few Koreans. In terms of Westerners, the more prominent the auction, the harder it is. So there's dealer auction, there at the low-level dealer auctions, all you have to do is be registered as a dealer in Japan and you can go. You don't need this introduction, but it's very low level, but they have interesting things. But that's another thing, how do you become a dealer? Anyone in Japan can become an art dealer by just going to their local koban and saying, give me the form. And you fill out your information, they hand it to them, and I mean, there's no training, there's no you don't need anything. And you can become a dealer in a day. They just check to see, all they're checking is, do you have a police record? If you have a police record, you cannot become a dealer. But other than that, anyone can become a dealer, which also was curious in some sense. But there are foreign dealers in Japan, but most of them aren't part of the dealing groups. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Berry, for your presentation, and especially for your last insight. I very much agree with it about globalization and the current state of art and also literature, actually. So your picture of Shinmonsen was very, very revealing for me. I think the same thing happens actually in Jinbocho, the book district in Tokyo. There's no people in the streets.
Yeah.
However, many bookstores there also find that online selling has allowed them to progress very much. So I was wondering if the same thing happens in art. If you have any optimism into digital media in that sense.
It's good that you mentioned that, because there is a lot of online activity, and there's the biggest one is probably Yahoo Online. It has a huge art section. The problem, of course, is that almost everything sold there is non-returnable. You have poor quality photographs, and the vast bulk of it is either junk or in bad condition or forged things. However, if you're extremely knowledgeable, it's possible to get some good things from there at good prices. Sometimes even fluky things of major works are inherited by somebody. They don't know what they are, and they just drop it online. It's chaotic. It's very hard to do well. If you're just wanting to decorate your house, it's a great way to do it inexpensively. But if you're actually wanting to accumulate serious artwork, it's there, but it's very hard to tell. And even if you have great skills, it's a tricky place. If you don't have great skills, you're likely to do very badly unless you're just buying what you like and it doesn't matter, which is what most people are doing there. In fact, even with these catalog sales, I used to be, because I do buy for myself some things from time to time, and I would ask them, there's like bookstores put out art catalogs. A lot of bookstores had a sideline in selling art, and it would be full of small photographs about this big of paintings and calligraphy. And one catalog might have 2,000 things and this big, and the prices are very low. But anytime I was interested in anything like that, I would make sure to finally find out who owned it and actually view the work. But it's very time-consuming and complicated, and sometimes you can't get access and whatever. But I noticed that I was one of the few people that's actually doing that. And I said, well, what about all these other people that are ordering? He said, well, they don't care. Again, they're buying it for whatever reason, but they know it might not be right, but it doesn't matter. So But yeah, the online things, and there are online auctions too. Sometimes the online auctions are connected usually to stores that have a viewing period where you can go, or sometimes an online auction, you can contact the store and they'll send you photographs of the work, sometimes detailed photographs. But even with detailed photographs, it can be very tricky because a general principle that I've felt with, and I take tens of thousands of photographs. I just have enormous photographic files, so I'm use them constantly. However, if you're talking about great art, it always looks worse in a photograph. If you're talking about lower quality things, it always looks better in the photograph than it does when you see it. So even having a lot of photographs is not as, fail-safe as it might seem. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Gracias. Thank you also, Matthias, to raise the question about Yahoo auction. But yeah. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How do you see the market for shunga, especially after this boom of shunga exhibitions and then some kind of decline in the shunga presence in the press and even in academic circles? So what do you think about shunga in the market right now?
Yeah, this would be I wish we had comparative dealings from the past, because how shunga was sold in the Edo period or the Meiji era or something would be interesting to know. But looking now, one thing that's remarkable about shunga, this sort of traditional form of erotica, is that lots of shops wouldn't handle it at all, and even those that did tend to be kind of embarrassed about it, and only if prodded would they bring it out a bit. So there was an old attitude, even works by very famous people tended to be really inexpensive, so that like an utamaro erotica or an utamaro of some other geisha or some other Yoshiwara scene or something, those would be higher. But if it's shunga, it would be hard to find, and when you found it, it would be unexpectedly inexpensive. But with these, there's been a huge population of books and magazines and other things reproducing older shunga, and those are increasingly just sold with other art books with no particular distinction, and so it has become increasingly comfortable for people to look at shunga or be seen looking at shunga, or it's interesting too, at the big shows like at the Eisei Bunko in Tokyo, more than half the viewers of this record-setting, really high-level shunga exhibition were women. So the clientele and who's looking at it and why and who feels comfortable looking at it and talking about it and stuff has changed a great deal. And so now prices of shunga are rising. Print stores that had them but would never advertise them are now advertising them. And so they're moving up steadily. They tend to be lower. This is, parenthetically, it's half off the topic, but this idea of being unique, one of the ironies for me about ukiyo-e is the division between prints and nikuhitsu works, actual paintings by the artists, because as we know with the prints, the name artist was at most doing the outlines or the basic format of the work and never touched any of them. And so they couldn't have been made without them, but on the other hand, there was sort of an indirection, and then they were often made in huge quantities. The prices of the best, in the best condition prints, I mean the most famous, not necessarily best, but the most famous prints in the best condition are often many times that of the actual painting by the same artist, which is unique and actually fully by the artist. And so something that was sold as a mass popular art of mass reproduction is actually, in selective cases, higher in value in today's market than the actual paintings by the artist, which shows that understanding market value and what generates is a very complicated thing. It's not a matter of actually what the artist actually made or not, and actually having part of the reason print prices at the upper level are so expensive is that there's such a giant collector base. And if you have Hokusai Fuji, there are many of them, but my condition, yours has a slight wrinkle over it. There's a stain over it. Mine doesn't. All these kind of collector fascinations drive the prices into a frenzy. Well, if you only have one painting, you either have it or you don't. It's either in this condition or not, but there's no discussion, there's no comparison. But this idea of having a huge collector base stimulates prices. It's a radical thing to say that I enjoy saying, is that the intrinsic value of art is zero. I'm not talking about cultural meaning, I'm not talking about historical aesthetic meaning, but the intrinsic value of art is zero. And what I mean by that is that if you look at art, even very famous works over centuries, you'll find artwork that sometimes is really expensive, at other times is literally thrown away, and it varies the price. If you chart values of art, it's going all over the place like this. Art prices are determined by market dynamics, which is, all kinds of factors influence market dynamics. But the intrinsic value of art in a financial market sense is undetermined. It's not there. But prices come and go all the time for different reasons. And this isn't, if you study this topic, you'll find this borne out. But people tend to think that high prices, something's really expensive, this must be the masterpiece of the ages or something. But no, it's just like, this is the popularity of the moment. And other ages and other times will see it differently. And so when you're talking about financial transactions, it's always about the marketplace. It's not about the intrinsic art has intrinsic values, but and I'm not criticizing art at all. In some ways, I'm almost releasing art to be itself in this thing. But the aesthetic value, historic value, and all this is all there. But the financial value is totally determined by market circumstance. And if you have any doubt about this, look at the two videos that have been made of the Axis Mundi sale that Leonardo rediscovered. They're two fabulous documentaries by two different crews who looked at the same thing. They're working entirely independent of each other, looked in the whole marketing of that or discovery of the work for about $1,100 in a small auction house in New Orleans to then about 15 years being $450 million. And they interviewed the art historians, the people that bought and sold it, they interviewed collectors, the person that was doing the conservation, the people that were exhibiting and stuff. And it's a total they're not promoting it, from my point of view, these two documentaries, it's a total expose of the art system. But it also shows too that, there was no intrinsic value to that painting. It was all just, it's $1,100 if it's being shown and sold in an obscure place in New Orleans, and $450 million is being sold by Christie's with a humongous advertising campaign of great complexity and sophistication. So interesting when we think about markets, I think.
I found the name of the documentary. It's called Lost Leonardo.
Yeah, that's one of them. There's two. Both of them. Yeah, any case, if you have any interest in one of them used to be on Netflix for a while, but I don't think it's on Netflix, but they're both on DVDs and a total education to the whole global system of valuation and sales.
Una última pregunta.
Okay.
Thank you very much
for
not only being here today, not only for today's talk, but for the rest of the days you've been here with us and for your workshop as well in Calus and for the first talk.
Well,
welcome here.
I'm really happy to be here and be meeting you, and I admire everybody's enthusiasm and energy that you're putting into your own individual interests and aspiring careers. So, ganbatte.
Thank you very much.